The moment Celia Brooks pulled the wide-brimmed hat down over her cropped hair and stepped into the lineup of trail hands gathered outside Dodge City's roughest outfitting post, she told herself the hardest part was already behind her. She was wrong, because the trail boss's sharp green eyes found her the instant she crossed the yard, and something in the way they lingered just a half-second too long told her that Elijah Donnelly already knew. It was the spring of 1873, and Kansas smelled like thawed mud and possibility, and the kind of danger that had no particular name yet. The Santa Fe Trail was still a living, breathing artery of commerce, and every cattleman, freighter, and fortune seeker within 400 miles was trying to move something south before summer heat made the journey punishing beyond measure. Celia had arrived in Dodge City 3 days earlier with nothing but a worn canvas saddlebag, her dead brother's clothing on her back, and a desperation so thorough it had burned away every other feeling she'd once known. Her brother Thomas had been 22 when the fever took him in February, leaving behind a debt to a land broker named Harlan Fitch that had transferred directly to Celia's name by the shameless manipulation of a legal document she had not been permitted to read before she was made to sign it. Fitch wanted the 40 acres Thomas had been working outside of Wichita, land their father had broken his back to homestead before his own passing the previous autumn. Celia was 20 years old, alone, and legally considered less than a full person by every court in the state of Kansas. The law offered her no recourse. The law, in fact, was Harlan Fitch's favorite weapon. She had made her decision on a cold Tuesday morning while standing at Thomas's grave with the frost still on the ground. She would travel south to Santa Fe, where a cousin of her mother's, a woman named Margaret Hale who had married a successful dry goods merchant, had written twice offering work and a room. The journey was 400 miles of trail, and no wagon company would take on a woman traveling alone without either a male guardian or a sum of money Celia did not possess. The cattle drives that moved along similar routes sometimes hired extra hands for pay that would be settled at the destination. It was the only door she could find. So she cut her hair with Thomas's straight razor, wearing it short and tucked under the hat he'd left hanging by the door. She wrapped linen tight around her chest each morning, drawing it firm enough to flatten her figure under the loose drover's shirt. She practiced walking with her weight forward, speaking from lower in her throat, and answering to the name Cecil, which was close enough to her own that she wouldn't forget to respond. She had Thomas's bedroll, his battered boots, his good work gloves, and his name scratched into the leather band of the hat, T. Brooks, close enough. The outfitting post belonged to a man named Garrett who smelled of tobacco and kept his records in a leather-bound ledger. He consulted with great ceremony before writing anything down. The trail crew being assembled was bound for Santa Fe under contract to move a remuda of 60 horses south for a ranching operation that needed fresh stock. It wasn't a cattle drive exactly, but it meant riding, camping, cooking over open fires, and sleeping under canvas with a group of men who would not appreciate the deception if they discovered it. Celia understood the risk. She had calculated it against the alternative and found the trail preferable. Elijah Donnelly was 30 years old, tall in the way of men who had done hard outdoor work since boyhood, with dark brown hair that curled slightly at the collar and hands that were weathered to a deep tan across the knuckles. He had trail-bossed 4 drives in the previous 2 years, the last of which had moved 800 longhorns from Texas to the railhead at Abilene without losing a single animal. Garrett trusted him absolutely, and the men who had ridden under him before sought him out for subsequent work, because he was fair and he was competent, and he did not manufacture crises for the sake of appearing important. He was standing at the gate of the yard when Celia walked in, clipboard in hand, running his eyes over each new hire the way a man checks the soundness of horses before a race. When his gaze reached Celia, it did not move on immediately. It held. She felt it the way you feel weather coming, a pressure change, a subtle shift in the air. She met his eyes because looking away would have been a mistake, and she kept her face still, and her jaw set in the approximation of boredom. She had practiced for 3 days in the mirror above the wash basin at the boarding house. Elijah Donnelly looked at her for exactly 3 seconds, then moved his eyes to the next man in line and made a notation on his clipboard. He never said a word. Not that morning in the yard, not during the initial equipment check, not when he came down the line asking each man his experience and his prior work. When he reached Celia, she said she had ridden since childhood and could handle horses without difficulty, which was entirely true, since Thomas had taught her everything he knew about working stock from the time she was 8 years old. Elijah noted something on his clipboard and moved on. His expression gave away nothing. The crew numbered 11, including Elijah himself. There were 2 men named Frank, one from Missouri and one from Arkansas, who distinguished themselves by their respective heights and were immediately called Big Frank and Little Frank by the others. There was a Mexican vaquero named Rodrigo Vargas who could throw a rope with a precision that bordered on artistic, and whose English was excellent, and whose temperament was steady as a stone wall. There was an older man named Percy Whitfield who cooked for the outfit and whose biscuits were, by unanimous and unsolicited testimony from 3 of the returning hands, the best that had ever been produced on the trail between Kansas and New Mexico. And there were 5 others of varying backgrounds and varying degrees of good humor, all of whom accepted Celia as Celia Brooks without a second glance, because people on the frontier saw what they expected to see, and none of them expected a woman. Elijah Donnelly was the only one who looked closely enough to see what was actually there. They departed Dodge City on a Thursday, moving the 60 horses in a loose herd that Rodrigo managed with particular skill, reading the animals' movements with the ease of long practice. Celia stayed to the outside of the group as they settled into the rhythm of the first day's riding, watching what the others did and matching it, staying busy enough that conversation remained minimal. The horses were mostly cooperative, and the day's work consisted primarily of steady movement south along the trail while Percy drove the supply wagon and hummed something tuneless under his breath. By midday, the sky had gone the particular shade of blue that belongs only to the Kansas plains in spring, high and clear, and so enormous it made a person feel simultaneously significant and very small. Celia had grown up under that sky, and it steadied her in a way that was difficult to explain but impossible to deny. She tilted her face toward it during a brief water break and let herself, for just a moment, breathe. "Brooks," she turned. Elijah Donnelly had ridden up beside her with the quiet competence of a man who moved through the world without announcing himself. He was close enough that she could see the small scar at the corner of his jaw, pale and old, the kind left by something sharp and long-heeled. "Yes, sir," she said, keeping her voice level, pitched down into the register she had been practicing. "Horse pulling left on you." She glanced down at her mount, a chestnut gelding she'd been assigned that morning. She hadn't noticed any particular issue, but she checked the reins and realized he was right. There was a subtle drift in the animal's lean that suggested something minor but worth addressing. "Might be," she admitted. "Check your bit when we stop tonight. Sometimes they sit wrong after being refitted. Rodrigo will show you if you ask him." "Much obliged," she said. He nodded and rode forward again without another word. It was such a practical, unremarkable exchange that it might have meant nothing at all. But Celia noticed that he had come to give her advice rather than observe what she did with the problem on her own, and she filed that away in the careful mental inventory she was keeping of everything about Elijah Donnelly. The first camp was made at the edge of a creek bed where cottonwood trees stood in a ragged line, their new spring leaves catching the late light and throwing it in shifting patterns across the ground. Percy had a fire going within 20 minutes of stopping, and had commenced a production of cornbread and salt pork that smelled extraordinary. The men moved through the established routines of camp-making hobbling horses, setting up canvas, rolling out bedrolls, and Celia followed what the others did precisely, making no mistakes she could identify, taking up a position at the edge of the camp that was neither isolated enough to seem strange nor so close to others that proximity risked discovery. She had thought, planning this journey from Thomas's cold kitchen in Wichita, that the greatest difficulties would be the physical ones. The riding, the weather, the rough food. She had not fully accounted for the social landscape of a working camp, the way men talked to each other in the firelight, the particular rhythms of their humor and their arguments, the easy physical carelessness of a group that had no reason to guard itself. Big Frank and Little Frank bickered cheerfully about nothing in particular. Rodrigo told a story about a horse he'd once roped in Sonora that was funnier than anything Celia had heard in months. A young hand named Deke Connors, who couldn't have been more than 19, laughed at everything with an enthusiasm that seemed to be his primary personality trait. Celia sat with her tin plate and ate Percy's cornbread and listened and laughed at the right moments, and gradually something in her chest loosened because this was survivable. This was manageable. She could do this. Then Elijah sat down 3 feet from her, which had not been where he was sitting a moment before, and she felt the familiar pressure of his awareness like a hand at her back. He wasn't looking at her. He was eating his own supper and listening to Rodrigo finish the story about the Sonoran horse, and his expression carried the slight amusement of a man who had heard good stories before and appreciated another one. But his positioning was deliberate. She understood this the way she understood that the gelding had been drifting left, not from a single obvious sign, but from the accumulation of small, specific evidence. She ate her cornbread and said nothing and waited. He spoke eventually, but not to her specifically. He said, addressing the group, that they had made good time, and that if they kept the same pace they would reach the Cimarron cutoff in 4 days, and that past the cutoff the trail narrowed and the water sources grew less reliable. So he wanted everyone to know the locations of the springs he'd marked on his maps. He went through these practically and without drama, and the men listened with varying degrees of attention, and Celia listened with total attention because knowing where the water was seemed to her like the most important information in the world. When he finished, he looked at the fire for a moment and then said, very quietly to no one in particular, "It's a long trail, harder than it looks on the first day, but every man here is capable of it, and I don't doubt any of you." He said it simply, the way a man might state a fact about the weather, and then he stood and went to check on the horses. But Celia heard it the way it was meant, as a kind of blanket reassurance that covered the whole group, and she thought that was a remarkable thing to do, to offer confidence so quietly that it could be received without embarrassment. She looked at the fire and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time, which was the particular warmth of being regarded as someone capable of doing something difficult. The second day was harder than the first, as trail days have a way of being when the novelty wears off and the body begins to register what it's actually being asked to do. Celia's thighs ached in the way that comes only from hours on horseback, and her chestnut gelding, whose bit she had adjusted the previous night with Rodrigo's help, a conversation conducted entirely in the practical language of horsemanship, was better but still required attention. The linen wrapping around her chest was uncomfortable in the growing warmth of the day, but removing it was impossible, and she gritted her teeth and rode, and reminded herself of Harlan Fitch and the 40 acres and Margaret Hale's letters in Santa Fe. Rodrigo rode beside her for an hour of the afternoon, teaching her a rope technique she had never seen before, a modification of the standard loop that allowed for a sharper throw in close quarters. He was a patient teacher, and his attention to her technique was entirely focused on the rope and never on her in any other sense. She liked him enormously for this, without his ever knowing she was grateful. That evening brought a brief but violent rainstorm that soaked the camp in 20 minutes and made Percy's fire-starting attempts a prolonged comedy of frustration, before he finally produced a flame that held. They ate a cold supper of hardtack and dried beef with wet clothes steaming in the grudging warmth of a small fire, and the mood of the camp was the particular combination of miserable and amused that a group develops when discomfort is shared equally. Celia had spread her bedroll in the most sheltered spot she could find under the wagon's overhang, which kept the worst of the dripping off. She changed her wrapping in the small hours of the night while the camp slept, crouching in the shadows beneath the wagon with practiced speed. And when she was done, she lay back on her bedroll and stared at the belly of the wagon above her and thought about Thomas, which was something she was trying not to do too often because it put a crack in the steadiness she needed to maintain. Thomas had been the kind of person who laughed first and thought second, and somehow always landed on his feet, despite this ordering of priorities. He had taught her to ride and to rope and to read the sky for weather, and he had said once, with complete seriousness, that she was better at all three than he was, and that this was both a compliment to her and a considerable embarrassment to him. She had laughed at that, and he had laughed too, and their father had shaken his head with the expression of a man who found his children both baffling and wonderful. She thought about that laugh until sleep found her. The third day was clear and windless and beautiful in the particular way of the southern Kansas plains in late April, the grass already greening and the sky doing its enormous blue thing again. And somewhere around mid-morning Elijah came alongside her without announcement and began talking. Not about anything significant at first. He asked about the chestnut, whether the bit adjustment had held, and she said it had. He mentioned that they would pass the ruins of an old stage station by afternoon, and that it was worth seeing if she'd never been this way before, which she hadn't. He said Percy was planning a proper stew that evening because he traded some hardtack with a passing freighter for a string of dried peppers and a quantity of onions, and that Percy's stew with proper vegetables was a thing worth anticipating. She answered all of this in short, practical sentences, maintaining her low register, and he listened to each answer with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, which was complete and unhurried. Then he said, still looking forward at the trail, "You handle that horse like someone who was taught young." "My father and brother," she said, which was the truth. "Good teachers, both of them." "The best," she said, and she felt the truth of it in her chest in a way that ached. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You've got good instincts too. That's not something you can teach. Either a person has a feel for animals or they don't." She looked at him then because something in the way he said it made her feel seen in a way she hadn't planned on. He was still looking forward at the trail and the horses, his profile clean against the sky, and there was nothing in his expression that was pointed or searching. He was simply saying a thing he believed. "Thank you," she said, and her voice came out slightly less managed than usual, slightly warmer in its register, and she watched to see if he noticed. He glanced at her briefly, and there was something in those green eyes that was careful and quiet and deeply knowing, and then he looked back at the trail and said, "You're welcome, Brooks," and rode forward to speak with Rodrigo. Celia let out a slow breath and looked at the enormous sky and thought, "He knows. He absolutely knows, and he is choosing not to say it," and she could not yet determine what that meant for her. The stage station ruins were exactly as advertised. A set of adobe walls half collapsed into the grass, the roof long gone, the door frame standing like the ghost of the building that had been. Elijah called a midday rest there, and while the horses grazed on the good grass around the ruins, several of the men explored the old structure with the particular interest that people have in things that have outlived their purpose. Celia found an old iron hook still bolted to one interior wall, smooth from decades of use, and she stood in the roofless room with the sunlight coming straight down and thought about all the hands that had hung things on that hook and were now as gone as the roof. Deke came in behind her, bubbling with questions about what the station might have been like when it was operating, and she answered them as best she could, having read more about the Santa Fe Trail than most people who had never traveled it, because Thomas had owned 2 books about Western exploration, and she had read both of them twice. Deke listened with his characteristic enthusiasm and said it must have been something to live out here when the country was first opening up. And Celia said yes, though she thought privately that opening up was an interesting way to describe what had been done to this land, and to the people who had lived on it long before any stage line ever existed. Because the truth of it was visible even here, even in the grass grown tall around these ruins. The Comanche and the Kiowa had ranged this country for generations before the trail pushed through, and the pushing through had been done with a violence and a contempt that no history book owned by a Kansas homesteader was going to fully reckon with. She had learned some of what was owed, though the world she lived in made no effort to pay it. That injustice was always somewhere in her peripheral vision when she rode this land, not consuming but present, the way a scar on the landscape reads differently once you know what caused it. She said none of this to Deke, because it was not the moment and he was 19 and enthusiastic, and she was trying not to complicate her own situation. But she thought it, and it sat in her with appropriate weight. That evening, Percy's stew was everything he had promised and more, a thick, fragrant production that the men consumed with the focused gratitude of people who have been eating trail food for 3 days and are encountering real cooking again. The dried peppers were aggressive and wonderful and made Big Frank's eyes water, which little Frank found extremely satisfying. Rodrigo produced a small guitar from somewhere in his belongings. Celia had not known he had it, and played in the firelight after supper, something quiet and lovely in a minor key that settled the camp into a gentler mood than the previous nights. Elijah sat near the fire with his map spread across his knees, going over the route, but she noticed that his pencil moved only occasionally, and mostly he was listening to the music. She was watching the fire and also watching him, in the careful indirect way she had developed, and she thought he had the face of someone who felt things deeply, and had made a practice of keeping that fact to himself. The slight tension that lived in him during working hours had softened in the firelight. He looked younger and less formal and somewhat sad, though the sadness was the ambient kind rather than acute, the sort a person carries with them everywhere rather than the kind attached to a specific recent wound. She wondered about his life the way she wondered about things she hadn't earned the right to know yet, with genuine curiosity and a patience she was still developing. The 4th day brought a different kind of trial. One of the horses, a gray mare that had been steady since Dodge City, developed a stone bruise on her left foreleg sometime in the morning and began favoring it noticeably by midday. Elijah called a halt to assess, and there was a discussion about whether to continue that day's pace or make an early camp to rest the mare. The economics of the situation were not complicated. 60 horses delivered on schedule meant full payment. 60 horses minus 1 delivered late meant a renegotiated contract and a loss. Elijah listened to everyone's opinion on the matter, including Celia's when he asked for it directly, which surprised her enough that she needed a half-second to collect her thoughts before answering. She said she thought resting the mare was the right call, that a stone bruise pushed too hard could become something worse, and the calculus of 1 lost day against 1 lost horse was clear. He nodded and made the call to camp early, which was the same call she would have made, and which several of the other hands had argued against on the grounds that the schedule was tight. He didn't credit her recommendation specifically, but he did, an hour later while they were both checking the mare's leg in the grass beside the creek where they'd made camp, say, "Good call on the mare. You thought it through right." She was crouching beside the horse's left foreleg, feeling along the underside of the hoof with careful fingers, and she looked up at him. He was crouching too, across from her, and at this proximity the distance between them was nothing, the width of a horse's leg and a little daylight. She could see his eyes clearly, and they were direct and warm and completely unguarded in a way she hadn't seen before. "You'd already made the same call," she said. "Maybe," he said, "doesn't mean your reasoning wasn't sound. They were quiet for a moment, both attending to the horse, the late afternoon light going gold around them and the creek making its small, constant conversation behind them. "Can I ask you something?" she said, and then immediately wondered why she was saying this. "Go ahead," he said. She looked back at the mare's hoof. "You've done this 4 times, this trail or something like it. Does it get easier?" She felt him considering the question seriously, which she appreciated. "Parts of it," he said finally. "The logistics get easier because you know what to expect. The people part doesn't get easier because it's different people every time and every person has their own way of being afraid and their own way of being brave." He paused. "But the first time you see the desert open up south of the Cimarron, that stays the same. That's always the same thing it is." "What is it?" she asked. He was quiet for another moment. "Something worth seeing," he said, and his voice had the particular quality of meaning more than the words contained, and Celia felt it settle into her chest like something warm. She straightened and brushed the grass off her knees. "I'll take your word for it until I see it myself," she said. He rose as well, and he was taller than she'd registered somehow, or she was simply more aware of it in this moment. He looked at her with those careful, knowing green eyes, and he said, "You will." And it was a statement of complete certainty, the kind you offer someone when you're telling them you believe in them. She walked back to the camp, and her heart was beating in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with something she was not ready to name. The gray mare rested that night and the following morning, and was sound enough to travel by the afternoon of the 5th day, which meant Elijah's schedule remained manageable with hard riding. The Cimarron cutoff was reached on the 6th morning, exactly as he'd projected, and standing at the edge of the flatter, drier country beyond the river crossing, Celia understood what he'd meant about the trail narrowing. The landscape changed character in a way that felt decisive, as though it had made up its mind about being inhospitable and was proceeding without apology. The crossing of the Cimarron was the most demanding thing she'd done yet. The water was higher than expected from the spring snowmelt further north, and moving 60 horses through it required exactly the kind of controlled chaos that is managed through experience and skill, and a great deal of noise. Rodrigo was everywhere at once with his rope, and Elijah directed traffic from a position in the current that put him chest-deep in cold water on horseback, shouting instructions in a voice that carried over the horse's commotion with complete authority. Celia worked the outer edge of the herd, pushing stragglers forward, and twice had to dismount and lead her chestnut through a deeper channel where the footing was uncertain. She was soaked to the thighs by the time the last horse reached the far bank, and so was everyone else, and there was a communal moment of dripping, breathless relief when it was over. Elijah counted heads, both human and horse, and then allowed himself a single brief smile that was mostly in his eyes. "Good work," he said to the group, which had become his version of enormous praise. Camp was made early that evening to allow wet gear to dry, and the mood was the specific high spirits that follow shared difficulty successfully overcome. Big Frank told the worst joke Celia had ever heard, and received a laugh from Deke that was entirely out of proportion to the material, and little Frank pretended to be mortally offended by the joke on aesthetic grounds, and Rodrigo played his guitar again, something faster and more cheerful than the previous night. Celia was wringing out her extra shirt near the fire when Elijah came and crouched beside her, close enough to speak quietly under the cover of Rodrigo's music and the general noise of camp. "You did well in the crossing," he said. "Rodrigo set the pace," she said. "Rodrigo set the pace for Rodrigo. You set your own pace and it was right." He paused. "I'm going to give you the south flank position tomorrow. It's more responsibility than you've had so far. I think you can manage it." She looked at him. The firelight was doing something interesting to his face, putting warmth into the planes of it, and his eyes were very green in the light. "Why?" she said, and she meant, "Why are you doing this? Why are you helping me? What are you seeing?" He said, "Because you're the best hand I've got for it, and because I think you need to know that someone can see it." The way he said it was so quiet and so precise that it landed exactly where he intended it to, which was in the place in her chest where she had been keeping the most carefully guarded version of herself, the version that had grown up competent and capable and consistently passed over because of what she was born as rather than what she had become. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "I'll do you proud in the south flank position." "I know you will," he said, and stood and walked away to check on the horses, and Celia stared at the fire until she was sure her face had settled back into something manageable. The south flank on the 7th day was exactly the responsibility he'd promised, demanding constant attention and quick decision-making, and she worked it through the full day without a single significant error, losing track of time in the way you only do when you're fully absorbed in something. Elijah watched from a distance without appearing to watch, which was a skill she was beginning to recognize as specific to him. At the end of that day he said, "Perfect," and moved on, and she thought, "This man will absolutely undo me if I am not very careful." She was not, it turned out, particularly careful. The desert opened up south of the Cimarron on the 8th day the way he had promised, wide and dramatic and strange, the red rock formations pushing up through the sage, and the sky performing its enormous act with particular intensity this far south. Celia saw it first around mid-morning, and felt something in her throat that was not quite emotion and not quite pain, but was made of similar material. It was the world being enormous and indifferent and beautiful in the same moment, which was a combination that always hit her somewhere precise. Elijah appeared beside her without her noticing the approach, which she was beginning to accept as simply something he did. "There it is," he said. "Yes," she said, and her voice had none of the practiced lower register in it, just her actual voice, which was not particularly low at all, and she heard it happen and waited for him to react. He looked at the desert and nodded slowly. "Worth seeing," he said, which was exactly what he'd predicted he would say. They rode in silence for a while, side by side, and the silence was the companionable kind that only exists between people who have moved past the need to fill space with noise. After perhaps 20 minutes, she said, very quietly, "You've known." It wasn't a question. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the trail, and his voice was even and unhurried. "Since the yard in Dodge City," he said. Something in her went very still. Then, "Why didn't you say anything?" Now he did look at her briefly, with those clear green eyes that were kind without being soft. "Because it wasn't my secret to tell," he said, "and because whatever reason brought you to that yard was enough reason." She felt the back of her eyes doing something she would not permit, and she looked forward at the red rock and the sage and blinked it away. "I needed to get to Santa Fe," she said, which was the essential truth. "Then we'll get you to Santa Fe," he said, and it was such a simple declarative sentence, and yet it contained so much protection and partnership and something that was not quite a promise but was made of the same intention. She looked at him for a long moment, and he looked back at her, and out there in the desert with the enormous sky doing its thing and the horses moving in their loose herd around them, something settled between them that had been unsettled since the yard in Dodge City. Not resolved exactly, not named, but acknowledged. A truth seen by both parties, regarded clearly and not flinched away from. "Celia," she said, "my name is Celia Brooks." He was quiet for a moment, the kind that contained something being felt rather than calculated. "Elijah Donnelly," he said, "pleased to meet you properly, Celia." His voice, saying her name, was something she had not expected. It moved through her like the first warm day after a hard winter, the kind that makes you realize how much the cold cost you. They rode on into the desert, side by side, and the day was long and the trail was hard, and everything between them had changed. Over the next 3 days, as the trail moved deeper into the territory that would eventually become New Mexico, Celia and Elijah found the natural rhythm of people who have been honest with each other about something important and are now able to speak from that honesty rather than around it. He continued to call her Brooks in front of the others, and she continued to be Cecil Brooks to the crew, and this arrangement held without apparent difficulty, because he maintained it as naturally as he did everything else, not with elaborate caution, but with the simple attention of a man who had decided something was right and acted accordingly. They talked most often in the evenings, when the camp was settled and the fire was burning, and the others were occupied with their own conversations or Rodrigo's guitar or sleep. Sometimes they talked about practical things: the next day's route, the condition of the horses, the water sources ahead. But gradually, the practical conversations developed a habit of expanding into other territory. She told him about Thomas in pieces over 2 evenings: the fever, the debt, the 40 acres. He listened without interjecting, in the way of a man who understands that listening itself is sometimes the most important thing. He said, when she had finished the outline of it, that Harlan Fitch was a particular kind of coward, the kind that used legal authority as a substitute for the courage that honest dealing would require. She agreed with this assessment entirely. He told her about himself in the same gradual way. He had grown up in Missouri, the son of a blacksmith who had taught him the value of doing things correctly the first time and the wisdom of keeping your word. His mother had died when he was 12, and he spoke of her with a careful tenderness that told Celia it was still a thing he was gentle with. He had come west at 20, initially working for a freighting company out of Kansas City, and had moved into trail work because he found he had a talent for it, and because it took him somewhere new at regular intervals which had suited him for a long time. "Does it still?" she asked. He considered this with his characteristic seriousness. "I've been wondering about that lately," he said. She looked at the fire. "What would suit you better?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Somewhere worth staying." She felt the weight of that and let it rest between them without pressing on it, because she was learning that he said things when he was ready to say them, and that the waiting was part of how it worked. On the 11th night, when the camp was asleep around them and the fire had burned low, and the desert was performing its nighttime version of itself, which was extraordinary, the stars more numerous and closer than anything she'd seen in Kansas. They sat with their backs against a flat rock and talked for 3 hours without noticing the time passing. She could not afterwards have recounted the specific progression of the conversation, only that it moved through a great many things, and that, somewhere in the middle of it, she realized that this was the most fully seen she had ever felt in her adult life. Not because he was looking at her particularly, though the way he looked at her was a distinct and pleasant thing, but because the conversation was the kind that only works when both people are being entirely themselves, and she was being entirely herself for the first time since she had put on Thomas's clothes and walked into Garrett's yard and begun performing someone she was not. She was Celia Brooks in the desert under these stars, and he was looking at her like she was the most interesting thing the desert contained, and the fire was low and the air was cold, and he shifted slightly so that his shoulder was against hers, warm and solid, and she did not move away. "Can I ask you something?" he said, which was unusual because she was generally the one who opened with that question. "Go ahead," she said. "When this is over," he said carefully, "when we reach Santa Fe and you get to where you're going, what do you want?" She thought about this with genuine seriousness, because she had been thinking about survival for so long that wanting felt like a foreign country whose language she was only beginning to recover. "I want the 40 acres back," she said first, because that was the most concrete and the most hers. "I want to go back to Wichita when I have enough to fight Fitch legally. I want land that my father broke and my brother worked to be in my name." She paused. "I want to not have to pretend to be someone I'm not, to be permitted to do things I'm fully capable of." He was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. Then, very quietly, "What else?" She looked at the stars for a while. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I've been so focused on getting through the next thing that I haven't let myself want anything that lives further out than the next water source." "That's a reasonable way to survive a hard stretch," he said. "Yes," she said, "but I'm hoping it won't have to be my permanent approach." He turned his head to look at her profile, and she felt it without turning. "I hope that too," he said, and his voice had a particular quality in it, something careful and genuine and reaching. And she turned her head and they looked at each other in the low firelight, very close because of the proximity their shoulders had established over the hours, and she thought, this is the moment where something happens. He raised one hand slowly and tucked a strand of her shortened hair back from her face with a touch so careful it barely registered, the way you touch something you're afraid of damaging. And then his hand was at her jaw, and she leaned into it the way the chestnut gelding had leaned into good handling, because it was the right pressure in the right place. "Celia," he said, her name again, her actual name. "Elijah," she said back, and it felt like completing a sentence. He kissed her so carefully, the way he did everything with total attention and no rushing, and the desert held them in its enormous quiet, and overhead the stars did their indifferent and wonderful thing, and she thought, oh, so this is what this is. They sat there for a long time after, not talking particularly, just present. And when the cold finally drove them to their respective bedrolls, they parted with a look that said everything the words hadn't gotten to yet. The 12th day was the best day of riding Celia could remember, partly because the country was beautiful and partly because she was alive to it in a way that happiness unlocks, that specific heightening of the senses that occurs when something in you has been fed that was hungry. She rode the south flank position with the ease of someone who has found their right work, and the horses responded to her, and the sky was blue, and the sage smelled sharp and good after a brief rain in the early morning. Elijah rode beside her for 2 hours in the afternoon, and they talked about small things and large things interchangeably, and once he said something that made her laugh so fully and openly that 3 of the other hands looked over, and she caught herself and composed her face, and he was smiling in that way he had that lived mostly in his eyes, warm and private. Rodrigo saw it, she realized. Not what she was, necessarily. She thought Rodrigo had probably known for days, because Rodrigo was extremely perceptive and also extremely discreet. But he saw whatever it was between her and Elijah, and he smiled to himself over his rope and said nothing, which she would have been grateful for even if she'd been in a position to express it. The 13th day brought trouble of the kind that trails in the territory were known for, though not of the kind she'd most feared. 2 men on horseback came up from the south in the early afternoon, moving fast, and Elijah assessed them before anyone else had fully registered their approach, and had the crew pulling the herd into a tighter formation, with a hand signal that everyone understood immediately. The men were not dangerous in the way of outlaws, but they were aggressive in the way of people who have calculated that a small crew-moving stock might be negotiated with through intimidation. They claimed the horses were moving through land their employer held, and that a fee would be required. Elijah let them finish their claim and then said, in the same voice he used for everything, that the Santa Fe Trail was a public road by precedent and territorial law, and that any man who tried to extract a toll from a legitimate operation would find the law considerably less friendly to his position than he was hoping, and that he had documentation for everything in his possession and was happy to wait for the territorial marshal's office to sort it out if they wished. He said all of this so calmly and so specifically that the 2 men looked at each other and found nothing to grab onto in terms of leverage, and after another minute of posturing they rode back the way they'd come. The whole encounter lasted perhaps 8 minutes. Deke let out a long breath that was half laugh. "Thought that might go different," he said. "It might have," Elijah said, "if we'd shown them anything to work with. Keep moving." They kept moving. Celia thought about the specific quality of competence that does not panic and does not advertise itself, and thought that she had been watching a master class in it for 2 weeks. That evening, she helped Percy with the supper preparation, which was something she'd begun doing in the previous few days as a way of being useful in a capacity that felt natural. Percy was 61 years old and had been cooking on the trail since before Celia was born, and he accepted her help without comment and directed her toward specific tasks with the efficiency of a man who had no patience for wasted motion. Peeling onions was an unglamorous contribution, but Percy treated it with the gravity it deserved. "You're good with a knife," Percy said at one point. "My brother taught me to cook," she said. Percy nodded thoughtfully. "Smart man," he said, which she took to mean either that Thomas had been smart to teach her, or that men who could cook were generally smarter than men who couldn't, or possibly both. Later, when supper was done and the camp had settled, Elijah came to sit beside her and they watched the fire together with the ease of familiarity, his arm against hers, the warmth between them something neither of them felt the need to comment on. "2 more days," he said. "2 more days," she agreed. She felt rather than heard what was beneath those 2 words for both of them, which was the complicated arithmetic of an ending that was also a beginning but hadn't fully figured out yet what it was beginning toward. "I've been thinking," he said. She said. "About what comes after Santa Fe," he said. "For me, specifically." She waited. "My contract on this delivery ends when we reach the ranch outside Santa Fe," he said. "After that I'm free to take whatever comes next." He looked at the fire. "I don't have to be back on the trail immediately. There's no particular urgency." She understood what he was not quite saying yet and chose to let him get there at his own pace. "What I mean," he said, with a slight awkwardness that was endearing because it was uncharacteristic, "is that I'm not in any hurry to be anywhere that isn't where you are. If that's something you can hear without it seeming presumptuous." She looked at him. The firelight was doing the same thing to his face it always did, and she thought, "I have been watching this face for 2 weeks, and I already know it better than I have known most people in my life." "It's not presumptuous," she said. "It's the most welcome thing anyone has said to me in a very long time." He turned to look at her, and his expression was something she hadn't seen from him before, open in a way that the trail boss competence usually kept carefully managed. There was relief in it, and hope, and something that was older and more careful but just as genuine. He took her hand there by the fire where anyone could have seen it, and held it with the same steadiness that was the entire quality of him. "Then we'll figure out what comes after together," he said. "Yes," she said, "we will." Santa Fe arrived on the 15th day in the late afternoon, the town materializing out of the desert like a thing that had decided to be there, and committed to the decision. Low adobe buildings the color of dried clay, the palace of the governors on the plaza looking exactly as the historical accounts described it, wide and weathered and permanent. The smell of the town was wood smoke and something spiced, and the particular dry warmth of adobe that has been sitting in the sun all day. The delivery of the horses to the ranch outside town was completed without incident the following morning, the rancher's foreman counting the animals with the careful attention of a man spending someone else's money, and Elijah's payment was settled, and the crew was paid their shares. There was a final meal together at a cantina on the plaza where someone had strung colored lanterns on the portal, and the food was extraordinary after 15 days of trail cooking, which even Percy acknowledged with the grace of a professional. The crew dispersed over the following 2 days, each man heading toward whatever came next. Rodrigo was headed further south, into Old Mexico, to see his family. The 2 Franks were going back to Dodge City on the next northbound stage. Deke had a cousin in Santa Fe and seemed genuinely excited about this. Percy intended to rest for 2 weeks at a boarding house he knew and then figure out his next contract. He hugged Celia when he left, which surprised her, and said, "You cook well for someone learning late," which was the highest praise she had received in several months. Celia went to find Margaret Hale on the second morning in Santa Fe, leaving Elijah at the hotel with an agreement to meet back for supper. The address from Margaret's letters led her to a prosperous-looking establishment on a street off the main plaza, dry goods displayed in the window with the neat confidence of a successful business. Margaret Hale turned out to be a round, energetic woman of 55 with her mother's dark eyes, and a manner of speaking that contained several languages at once, because she had been living in Santa Fe long enough to think in Spanish half the time. She welcomed Celia with a warmth that required no warming up, immediately sat her down with coffee and food, and listened to the full account of Thomas and Fitch and the 40 acres, and the trail with the focused attention of a woman who processes information quickly and makes decisions at the same pace. "You'll stay here," Margaret said, when Celia had finished. "We'll find you proper work in the shop, which you'll be good at because you're clearly capable, and we'll write to a solicitor in Wichita about this Fitch situation. My husband knows a man in Topeka who handles exactly this sort of land dispute and wins." She refilled Celia's coffee with the authority of someone for whom hospitality was an extension of competence. "And you'll have a room that locks and an income, and you'll be able to breathe." Celia sat with the coffee in her hands and felt something in her chest, a knot that she had been carrying coiled and tight for so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to not have it there. "Thank you," she said, which was not nearly sufficient, but Margaret waved it aside. "Family," she said, with the absolute simplicity of someone for whom the word is a complete sentence. Celia also told Margaret about Elijah, because she found she could not, and because Margaret was the kind of person who would notice everything worth noticing within approximately 4 minutes, and there was no point in misdirection. Margaret listened to this part of the account with a different quality of attention, warmer, more amused, and extremely interested. "Bring him to supper," Margaret said, when Celia had told the essential shape of things between them. "Tonight. My husband Albert will want to meet him, and I will want to evaluate him, and you clearly need someone in your corner who can see a larger picture than a trail hand." "He's more than a trail hand," Celia said, with a sharpness she hadn't planned. Margaret smiled the smile of a woman who has just received exactly the information she was fishing for. "Yes," she said, "I can see that." Elijah came to supper at the Hale household that evening in the cleanest clothes he had, which were not formally impressive but were worn on a person who had the particular quality of being comfortable in himself, which Margaret recognized within 30 seconds and approved of visibly. Albert Hale, who was 60 and cheerful, and had come to Santa Fe from Connecticut 20 years earlier and never left, asked Elijah 17 questions about the trail over supper, with the enthusiasm of a man who loves stories from other people's adventures, and Elijah answered each one with the directness and detail that Albert clearly found satisfying. Margaret watched Elijah watching Celia across the table and said nothing, but the look she gave Celia when their eyes met was a complete and sufficient communication. Over the following weeks, Santa Fe became the landscape of something that Celia had not expected to find in the middle of survival, a life she wanted to be in. She worked in the dry goods shop and was good at it in the way that Margaret had predicted, because she was organized and capable and quick with figures, and genuinely liked the steady traffic of people who came in with specific needs and left with them met. The work was honest, and it was hers, and nobody asked her to pretend to be someone else. Elijah stayed. He did not announce this as a decision so much as he simply continued to be present, finding work in Santa Fe without difficulty, because the territory needed men who were competent with horses and knew the trails, and he hired on with a freighting operation that kept him in and around Santa Fe most of the time. He had a room at a boarding house 2 streets from the Hale establishment, and he came to the shop most evenings, and they walked the plaza in the long, warm dusks of the Santa Fe spring and talked about everything. They talked about the 40 acres in Wichita, which the Topeka solicitor that Albert Hale contacted was already beginning to investigate. The solicitor, a methodical man named Good who communicated by letter with reassuring frequency, had found that Harlan Fitch's legal maneuvering, while aggressive, had a procedural weakness in the transfer documents execution that might be challenged successfully in the Kansas courts. This was not a guarantee, but it was a door, and Celia was learning that she had a talent for doors. They talked about his life in Missouri and her life in Kansas, and what they each understood about family and loss, and the specific way that land gets into a person who has worked it, becoming less a possession than an extension of the self. He understood this completely, because his father's blacksmith shop had been sold after the elder Donnelly's death 3 years before, and Elijah still felt the loss of the specific smell of that shop coal and iron, and his father's particular quality of focus, in a way that nothing else had quite replicated. "I think that's why the trail suited me for so long," he said one evening, walking the plaza as the evening turned golden around them. Moving meant not being in any one place long enough to miss it. "And now?" she asked, though she thought she knew. He stopped walking and looked at her. They were in the last of the day's light, which was doing extraordinary things to everything it touched, and he had the look of a man who has arrived somewhere and knows it. "Now I'm somewhere I'd miss," he said, rather urgently. She looked up at him, and she thought about the yard in Dodge City and the desert and the stars and his hand at her face and every conversation they had ever had, and she said, "I would miss you rather urgently too if you left." He cupped her face in both hands, those trail-weathered hands that were somehow the most careful thing she knew, and he kissed her there in the plaza in the golden light, with Santa Fe going about its business around them and not particularly noticing. When they separated, she laughed, which she hadn't meant to do, and he laughed too, and it was the best sound she had produced in a very long time. "Elijah," she said. "Yes," he said, as though she had asked a question and he was already answering it. "I think I love you," she said. "I'm relatively certain of it, though I acknowledge I haven't had extensive comparative experience." He looked at her with those green eyes that were the warmest thing in the warm evening. "I love you," he said, without the qualifier, directly and completely, the way he did everything. The letters from Good in Topeka arrived with increasing urgency through the summer of 1873. The procedural weakness in Fitch's document was real, Good reported in July, and the Kansas court system, while not fast, was not impenetrable to the right argument. There would need to be a hearing, and Celia's presence would be required. She read this letter twice, sitting in the back of the Hale shop with the afternoon heat pressing against the adobe walls, and felt the particular weight of unfinished business that had been waiting for the right moment to be finished. She told Elijah that evening. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "When do we leave?" "We," she said. "Yes," he said. "We." She looked at him, and the question she didn't quite ask was visible, and he answered it without being asked. "Marry me first," he said, which was the most direct proposal she could have imagined from a man known for direct statements. "Then we go to Wichita and deal with Fitch and retrieve what's yours. And then we come back to Santa Fe, or we stay in Wichita, or we go somewhere else entirely. I'll follow your preference because it's your 40 acres and your decision. But I want to be there with you for all of it." She looked at him for a long moment, and the thing she felt was so enormous that she needed a moment to find the right place to put it. "Yes," she said. "Yes to all of it." They were married in Santa Fe on the 4th of September, 1873. By a justice of the peace whose office smelled of pine resin and old documents, with Margaret and Albert Hale as witnesses. Margaret cried with a thoroughness that suggested she had been saving these tears for the appropriate occasion, and was now deploying them with gusto. Albert shook Elijah's hand so vigorously that it constituted a small upper-body workout. Rodrigo Vargas, who had come back through Santa Fe on his way north, appeared unexpectedly at the last moment and stood in the back with his hat pressed to his chest and a smile that took up most of his face. Celia wore a dress that Margaret had helped her find at a seamstress on the plaza, the color of the desert sky in late afternoon, a particular blue that was neither pale nor dark, but exactly itself. She walked into the justice's office feeling like herself in a way that she had not felt in public for so long it was startling. No wrapping, no hat, no borrowed name, just Celia Brooks, Celia Donnelly. As of the next 20 minutes, in a dress the color of the sky, exactly herself. Elijah looked at her with such total and undisguised feeling that she felt it like sunlight, warm and clear and everywhere. They left for Wichita on the 12th of September, the two of them and their horses, and what they needed for the journey, retracing with minor variations the route she had traveled in Thomas's clothes and Thomas's boots in April. Riding the trail back was a different experience in every way, the landscape the same, her position in it entirely altered. She was not alone. She was not hiding. She was not surviving by the narrowest possible margin. She was on a horse in the early autumn light with the man she had married, and the 40 acres at the end of it, and the particular forward momentum of someone who has decided what they want and is going to get it. They camped on the trail as they had on the delivery, and the nights were the same spectacular desert nights, and they talked with the ease of married people who are still discovering each other, which is one of the better conditions available to human beings. He told her stories about his Missouri boyhood she hadn't heard yet. She told him about her mother who had died when Celia was 7 and who had been, by all subsequent accounts and her own dim clear memories, a woman of considerable strength and a very specific kind of humor that lived in the eyes more than the mouth. Elijah listened to this with the quality she'd come to depend on, complete and warm. "She would have liked you," Celia said. "You have that quality she had of taking things seriously without being solemn about them." "That's a generous thing to say," he said. "It's a true thing to say," she said. "I've gotten very particular about only saying true things. It's a reaction to spending several months saying untrue things about my own name." He smiled. "A reasonable reaction." They reached Wichita in late September, the town considerably more developed than she'd left it in February, the railroad bringing a ceaseless transformation that made places seem to change their character with every returning visitor. She went first to Thomas's grave, which she had not seen since she'd left it in the frost, and stood there with Elijah beside her in the warm September afternoon, and said what she had to say to Thomas, which was partly gratitude and partly apology, and partly the specific communication of someone keeping someone else informed. Then they went to see Good, who was a spare, precise man with reading spectacles and the firm handshake of someone who trusts his work, and spent 2 days going over the case in detail. The procedural flaw in Fitch's document was exactly what Good had described. The transfer had required 2 witnesses to be legally binding under Kansas statutes, and only one had signed. It was small enough that Fitch had counted on no one looking, and specific enough that a court would be required to act on it. The hearing before the Sedgwick County Circuit Judge took place on the 8th of October, 1873. Harlan Fitch came with his own attorney, a man who was impressive in manner and weak in substance, and the 2 attorneys argued the point with the precision of a conversation that was always going to have one outcome and was simply performing itself to its conclusion. Celia sat very still through all of it, her hands folded, Elijah's shoulder against hers. The judge ruled in her favor on the substance of the procedural flaw and declared the transfer invalid. The 40 acres reverted to the estate of Thomas Brooks, and as Thomas's sole surviving heir, Celia was the legal owner. Fitch's attorney raised a secondary argument about creditor claims, and the judge heard it with visible impatience and ruled against it on grounds that Good had anticipated and prepared for meticulously. When it was done, and they stood on the courthouse steps in the October light, Celia held the copies of the ruling in both hands and looked at the words without reading them because she didn't need to read them anymore. She just needed to feel the weight of the paper. Elijah put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him. "It's yours," he said. "It's ours," she said, which she had decided on the trail without telling him and which she now told him, watching his face receive it. He looked at the papers and then at her, and his expression was the open one she had first seen in the desert by the low fire, the one that didn't manage itself. "Are you sure?" he said. "Thomas would want it worked," she said. "I know how to work it. You know how to build things and manage a place. Margaret is going to be furious that we're not coming back to Santa Fe." She looked at the courthouse and then at the town and then at him. "But this is the land. This is where we should be." He looked at the October sky, which was doing a particular Kansas thing, enormous and golden-edged, and nodded once with the certainty that was specific to him. "Then this is where we'll be," he said. They spent that winter getting the homestead in order, which was considerable work that had been waiting since Thomas's death in February for someone with the energy and the resources to attend to it. The cabin needed repairs that Elijah addressed with the careful competence of someone who had watched his father work with his hands for 18 years. Celia put the first season's garden under cover and planned the spring planting with the focus she brought to everything, reading seed catalogs that Margaret sent from Santa Fe with a note that said if they were going to be stubborn about Kansas, then at least they should have proper seeds. The 40 acres were good land, and working it together was something Celia had not known to want and now found she could not imagine not having. The rhythm of it, the shared effort, the small daily negotiations, the accumulation of decisions made together, was different from any other relationship she had experienced, warmer and more practical simultaneously, the two things reinforcing each other in a way she had not known was possible. Rodrigo stopped through in December, heading south from a job in Abilene, and spent 3 days helping them winterize the barn in exchange for Percy's stew recipe, which Celia had extracted from Percy before leaving Santa Fe and which she had been improving through the autumn. Rodrigo ate 2 bowls and said it was nearly as good as the original. She took this as a compliment of the highest order. By the time the Kansas spring came again, soft and green and enormous, Celia was carrying their first child, which she told Elijah on a morning when the ground was just beginning to thaw and the sky was doing its blue thing, and she felt, for the first time in her adult life, that she had enough good things around her that she was almost frightened of them. He was very quiet when she told him, in the way that meant something was happening in him that was too large for immediate words, and then he looked at her with an expression that was purely wonder, no management at all, just the fact of the feeling. "A baby," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at the land, the 40 acres of it lying out in the spring light, and she knew he was thinking the same thing she was, that Thomas would have loved this, that her father would have wept with good feeling, that this was what land is for when it belongs to the right people, not for hoarding or leverage, but for building something on, for growing something that outlasts the growing season. He put his hands on her face, his careful weathered hands, and kissed her forehead and then her temple and then her cheek with the tenderness of someone who means everything he does. "We need a bigger garden," he said against her hair. She laughed, and the sound went out across the 40 acres and into the Kansas morning, and it was exactly the sound that a life coming right makes. Their son was born in October of 1874, a year to the month after the courthouse steps in Wichita, and they named him Thomas James Donnelly. Thomas for the brother who had made everything possible in ways he would never know, James for Elijah's father. He came into the world with a particular set of opinions about it that he communicated at full volume, and Elijah held him in the lamplight of the cabin, with an expression that would have been unreadable to anyone who didn't know him well, and which Celia read precisely as the complete and unconditional opening of something that had always been there. Margaret Hale came from Santa Fe for the birth, arriving 3 days before as if she'd calculated it, because she was the kind of woman who calculated things correctly. She brought half the dry goods shop's most useful stock packed into 2 trunks and stayed for 6 weeks, during which time the cabin was well organized. The vegetable cellar was sorted. Elijah was given detailed opinions on 3 different topics per day with which he engaged cheerfully, and Thomas James Donnelly was confirmed to be, by unanimous assessment, an extremely fine and extremely loud example of his kind. When Margaret left on a crisp November morning, she held Celia's hands on the porch steps and looked at her with the particular expression of someone who knew a person's full story and was glad it had come out the way it had. "Your mother would be proud," Margaret said. Celia nodded, because she could not speak immediately, and Margaret accepted this and held her hands a moment longer and then released her, and got into the wagon that would take her to the stage. The years that followed settled into the cadences of a life built carefully and inhabited fully. The 40 acres proved their quality under consistent work, producing well enough by the second full season that Elijah and Celia were able to repair the eastern fence line and add a small dairy shed that made a material difference to the household economy. They knew their neighbors, the Calloway family to the north and the Reinhardts to the east, and were known by them, which is the particular social achievement of building something real in a place rather than passing through it. The trail was not entirely behind them. Elijah took occasional consulting work for freighting operations that needed someone who knew the southern routes, but these were short engagements of days rather than weeks, and the homestead was never far from the center of his attention. He had become, in the way of men who have found the right place to be, deeply rooted. Celia worked the land and managed the household accounts with equal facility, and also, because she was who she was, began teaching reading and arithmetic to several of the neighboring families' children, whose nearest school was too distant to be practical. 3 days a week in the cabin kitchen, which became a sufficient argument for building an additional room. She was good at teaching, which did not surprise her because she had always found that explaining things clearly was a pleasure rather than a chore. The children came in with the mud on their boots and the uncertainty of people entering unfamiliar territory, and left with the small particular satisfaction of having understood something that had previously been opaque. Little Thomas, who became Tom by common agreement around the time he could walk reliably, was a child of the most characteristic combination of his parents. His father's green eyes and his mother's absolute determination, and a laugh that appeared to belong to someone entirely himself, unrelated to either preceding generation, large and sudden and infectious. He was interested in horses from approximately the moment he could be safely placed on one, and Elijah taught him with the patience of a man who had learned from good teachers and intended to pass that on. In 1877, their second child arrived, a daughter they named Ruth Elijah Donnelly, Ruth for Elijah's grandmother, Elijah because Celia had always loved the name. Ruth was quieter than Tom and more observant, watching the world with a careful focus that Celia recognized because she had done it herself, though with less favorable circumstances. Ruth grew up knowing she was capable of any task on the property, because neither of her parents had any interest in suggesting otherwise. By the time Tom was 5 and Ruth was 3, the homestead had expanded to include a proper barn, a well-maintained kitchen garden, and a modest but comfortable expansion of the original cabin that gave everyone enough space to not be on top of each other during the Kansas winter. Elijah had also begun, at Celia's suggestion, and with her considerable organizational assistance, a small horse breeding operation, working with the stock knowledge he'd accumulated over years of trail work, and the first 2 seasons of it had been promising enough that there was talk of expanding. Margaret Hale wrote from Santa Fe regularly, letters that were long and affectionate and full of Santa Fe news, and which Celia answered with equal regularity. Rodrigo passed through twice more over those years, once with a wife of his own, a dark-eyed woman from Albuquerque named Esperanza who assessed the homestead, and the children and Celia and Elijah with the same perception Rodrigo brought to everything, and pronounced herself satisfied with all of them, which Celia counted as a considerable honor. On a September evening in 1878, 5 years after the courthouse steps, 5 years since Celia had stood with the ruling in her hands and Elijah's arm around her shoulders, they sat on the porch of the expanded cabin in the warm last light of the day. Tom was asleep inside, and Ruth was in the process of following him there, having conducted a prolonged negotiation about it that she had ultimately lost, as she always did, to the simple fact of childhood exhaustion. The 40 acres lay out before them in the long golden light, the grass moved by a small wind, the horses in the near pasture moving with the easy contentment of animals that have nothing to fear. The barn threw a long shadow east. The garden was past its last harvest and waiting now for the year to turn it back. Elijah had his arm around her shoulders, as he had on the courthouse steps, as he had on the trail in the desert under the stars, as he had in all the intervening time that had turned from days into years, and in doing so had become the foundation of everything. "Do you remember," she said, looking at the land, "what I said on the trail about wanting things? You said you'd been so focused on survival you hadn't let yourself want anything further out than the next water source," he said, without having to think about it. "Yes," she said. "I remember thinking that I hoped it wouldn't have to be my permanent approach." "And is it?" he said. She looked at the land, she looked at the horses, she looked at the house where her children were sleeping. She turned and looked at him, at the face she knew completely now, the small scar at the corner of his jaw, the green eyes that were warm and direct and entirely present. "No," she said, "it is emphatically not." He smiled, not the trail boss smile, not the careful managed expression, but the one she'd first seen in the desert by the low fire, the open one, the one that was just him, and he pulled her close and she leaned into it the way she always did, certain and home. The Kansas evening settled around them. The light went warm and then golden, and then the first stars appeared, the same stars that had watched them in the desert 5 years ago, indifferent and wonderful and perpetually themselves. She thought of the yard in Dodge City, and the hat pulled down over her cropped hair, and the wide-open desperation of a woman with nothing but her brother's boots and her own considerable self. She thought of those 3 seconds when Elijah's eyes had found her and held and known, and the choice he had made in the 3 seconds after that, to say nothing, to see her, to let her be who she needed to be until she could be who she was. She thought what a thing to be seen clearly by the right person at the right moment. "I never thanked you properly," she said. "For what?" he said. "For not saying a word," she said. "In the yard when you knew." He was quiet for a moment and she felt him thinking it through. "You didn't need my silence," he said. "You were going to make it either way. You were always going to make it." "Maybe," she said. "But your silence was a kindness, and I've thought about it many times, and I want you to know that it mattered." He pressed his lips to her temple, gentle and certain. "You would have done the same," he said. She thought about this and realized he was entirely right, which was one of the things about him that she found most reliable. The way he saw her accurately, not as she wished to be seen, and not as the world's convenience required her to be seen, but as she actually was. She was Celia Donnelly, née Brooks, 25 years old and the owner of 40 acres and the mother of 2 children and the wife of the best man she knew. And she had ridden 400 miles in her dead brother's clothing with her heart in her throat and her jaw set against the world. And the world had, in the end, been worth getting through. The stars came out fully now over the Kansas plains, doing their enormous faithful thing, and the horses settled in the near pasture, and somewhere inside the house, Ruth murmured something in sleep and was quiet again, and the evening held everything it contained with the simple competence of evenings that have no cause to be otherwise. Elijah held her against his side and looked at the stars and the land and said nothing, because nothing needed saying, because they were both entirely present in a life that had been built from the most desperate of beginnings into something they would not have traded for anything the world's easier paths might have offered. And the 40 acres breathed in the evening air, fully and permanently hers, and the horses moved in the starlight, and the Kansas sky performed its ancient, enormous act above everything, and Celia Brooks Donnelly looked at all of it and thought, yes, this, exactly this is what was worth getting to.